Flight has been a human dream since ancient times. From the mythological tale of Icarus and his father Daedalus to the development of the modern airplane, flight has been something humans seem to have been fascinated with. In AER Memoreis of Old, we get to visit this fascination with flight as a protagonist that can transform into a bird and fly across a fantastical world in the clouds. While this sounds like an interesting concept for a game, does it live up to the idea, or does it fall a little short? Let's take a look. AER Memoreis of Old is a 3D puzzle platformer developed by Forgotten Key. It was released in 2017 for PC, PS4, and Xbox One, with a Switch version releasing in 2019. I am playing the PS4 version on the PS5 for this review. AER is $14.99 on every system except the Switch, which is for some reason $19.99. It is rated E10 and really has nothing in it to be concerned about in terms of content. AER Memoreis of Old is one of those games that is fairly light on the story. It drip feeds you details about the world and drops hints at what you're dealing with, but the story never exactly feels compelling. There's never really a time that you're given narrative dumps or exposition talking to other characters that amounts to a lot. You start out as Ak, a girl on a pilgrimage that seems to be a tradition for the people of the sky. At your first stop on this pilgrimage, Ak appears to be recognized as some kind of chosen one and is given the Lantern of Destiny. Well, it's not really called that, but it is what Ak is presented with and kind of gains, which makes her seem to be special anyway. In the past, your world experienced a cataclysmic event. The lands that were united were split apart, separated, and maybe put into the sky. It's not fully clear whether they are always in the sky or whether the sky part happened with that as well. Nobody seems to fully know what happened in the past, but somehow the priestess Kara wound up being able to help people survive the great catastrophe. It's the kind of story that is very vague, but also gives you enough to get the general sense of what your quest is and some of the background of the world. You're now the chosen one to solve the mystery of what happened and realize that the threat of the past is maybe not as gone as thought. You're also handily enough able to transform into a bird, which makes traveling to all these separate sky islands fairly easy. As you continue your pilgrimage, you learn more and more about the past and what has been going on in this world, even if what you do learn doesn't really amount to a whole lot. The story just never really gripped me. It's way too vague and lacking in impact. If you're going to have a narrative, I'd like it to be a bit stronger. This just feels unsatisfying from the start to the end. Not to mention, the world just feels so very devoid of life. There are a total of 4 other people you meet and get to interact with in the entire game, if you don't count the spirit animals that are also there. Is the world that far gone, or are all the people just somewhere we can't go? It's never really made clear. I'm assuming that there are other people in this world, but the way that everything's presented makes the world feel so very empty, and that just makes it even harder to get invested in. Like with a weak story, as long as you have like characters and a world that seems alive, like that can help feel a little bit more invested in. But you don't have that here. You don't really have a strong story, nor do you have a world where you get invested and connected to kind of like the NPC characters all that much. So it just really kind of was unsatisfying for me. Now, I'll be honest, a game doesn't always need to have a compelling story in order to grab a hold of my interest. Fun and interesting gameplay can cover a multitude of story issues or can replace the need for a story in the first place. The problem is, AER doesn't really have that great of gameplay. It's not necessarily bad, but it's just not good enough to really make up for a vague and unfulfilling story. Gameplay can pretty much be divided down into 3 sections: flight, platforming, and puzzles. The most fun and interesting aspect of gameplay is flight. It is a lot of fun to fly around, and the world is vibrant and unique, so it is a pretty world to be able to have that chance to explore as a bird and flying around and everything like that. Now, even though it is fun to fly, flight didn't always feel the smoothest to use. And I think the biggest problem is that flying from one piece of land to another takes a little longer than it should. You can get there faster by flapping your wings and increasing speed, but when you actually get to your location, you can be moving a bit too fast and wind up crash landing rather spectacularly. This doesn't necessarily hurt you or anything unless you fall completely out of the sky and you have to get respawned somewhere, but it still just felt a bit off. It felt like flight was more about flying long distances than being able to fly deftly within like the smaller island settings. So it was just kind of a weird feel that the flight aspect had. This is made a bit worse since you constantly need to go back to the lighthouse, the main island that you have, there are a few people at, to get an idea of where your next destination is. This means that you have to fly back and forth quite a bit. And when you do that, you're going by these same islands multiple times and also flying through the more barren airspaces for a significant amount of your playthrough. Now, the islands are fun to explore the first time you run into them, but once you find some of the interesting locations that are there really isn't much else to do except fly by them. Maybe if you really liked a location, you could look at it for a little bit longer, but there just isn't really that much there. The second part of the game is platforming, and you do this whenever you get to various locations like temples or caves. Now, for some reason, when inside, you are unable to transform into a bird. Now, I don't think I was ever given a reason for this in-game, like connected to the lore or anything. It felt like it was just something to limit you because otherwise it would be far too easy to skip the platforming and solve puzzles without really having to work at anything. And then I get this, and that doesn't really bother me too much. But the platforming itself didn't feel great. The jumping in the game is a bit floaty, and it can take some time getting used to. This just made the platforming sections feel a bit off to me, and while I never had that much problem with it, there were a few times that the floatiness of the jumping did result in some missed platforms and having to kind of go back and do the jumps over again. In the temples and locations that you have to travel to, you will also have to solve puzzles to progress. Now, these puzzles aren't really all that difficult and are more about finding buttons to press, matching patterns, or pointing something in the right direction. I never really had any problem with the puzzles, but later on it did feel like these sections were drug out a bit longer than needed just to kind of maybe pad out the time or make it seem like it was more difficult when it was just really, in essence, longer. And I guess really whether you like this or not depends on what you like in terms of puzzle games. If you like puzzles that are challenging, this is going to be very disappointing. If you like really easy puzzles that just give you the feeling that like, oh, I'm solving something, even if it's not really that tough, then this will kind of be up your alley. I tend to kind of be in between. Like, I don't like it when puzzles are too hard, but this one maybe goes too much to the too easy side of things. So it's not bad, but it's maybe a little too easy. The game itself is also not very long. It took me around 4 hours to complete my playthrough, and I was going around trying to explore things and get trophies on the various islands and things like that through that playthrough, so it could be a little bit longer than what some people would do. And I'm honestly not really sure that this is a good thing. The game doesn't overstay its welcome, so like with all of its flaws, like it doesn't really start to be like, oh, this is really bad, but it also isn't a very long experience either. And considering that it's $15 or $20 if you're on the Switch, this feels like a game that is a bit expensive for what it has on offer. So these gameplay elements combine for an experience that was just okay in my opinion. It wasn't really a very exciting experience for me. For me, it pretty much fell in line with my feelings about the story. Like, there are some interesting things about it, but overall it just felt kind of a little off as well. So in this sense, like, the journey didn't really make up for the lack of destination in this case. In other words, the gameplay doesn't really make up for the kind of weak story. The art style also has me mixed. I really enjoy the vibrant colors of the world of Air. I'm always a sucker for vibrant art styles, and that's part of what made Air look interesting to me in the first place. Getting to fly over the world is a lot of fun, and there are all kinds of little unique locations to find and explore as extras in the game, which allows you to see more of the world. The part that makes me mixed is the low poly side of the art style. I don't tend to mind this art style when it comes to landscapes and environments, but I don't love it for character models. Particularly human character models, as the animal spirits in this, they weren't terrible. Having characters with no faces and therefore no facial expressions always seems a bit weird to me. I don't hate it, like it's not like, oh, I would never get games like this, but I just don't know that I love the art style either. It's just kind of one of those things like, I'm so mixed because I do like it when it comes to landscapes and kind of environments, but when it comes to more of like the character models and things like that, they don't attract me quite as much. So it's kind of one of those things I'm always a little bit mixed on. At this point, it's probably also not too surprising that the sounds for the game were also just okay for me. The music is very chill and atmospheric, but many don't really stand out that much. There are a few more upbeat tracks that are kind of fun and I did enjoy a little bit more, but overall it's a pretty low-key soundtrack, which, I mean, it does fit the vibe of the game, so that's great, but it doesn't really make a lasting impression. Sound effects also were kind of in that range, like they were fairly standard. There is only one sound that I remember kind of being annoyed at, and that is the high-pitched hum that happens when you're around spirits that are revealed by the lantern. That sound could kind of grate after a while, but that's really about the only one that comes to mind as being like, I didn't like that sound that much. The rest were just okay. Now, I did run into a pretty significant bug early on in my playthrough of AER. After leaving the starting cave, there is kind of an in-game tutorial section to teach you how to fly and do things like that. And the first time I played it, I didn't follow it exactly. This made me unable to turn back into a bird, and thus because of all the separate floating islands, I wasn't able to make any more progress in the game. I had to restart. It's never good to start a game and then have to restart the story 10 minutes into it because of a bug. It's a pretty significant bug, and you'd think after so many years that that would have been taken care of. But at this point, it's never going to. AER Memoreis of Old is a game that I wanted to like a lot more than I did. A game about a girl who can turn into a bird and then goes on a quest to temples of the gods to find out what happened to her world and stop the destruction that seems imminent again is an interesting premise. The reality just doesn't really live up to that premise. It's not that the game is bad, it's just kind of underwhelming. Every aspect of the game had some flaws that just kept me from enjoying the game as much as I would have liked. Add in at least one pretty big bug, it makes for a game that easily gets lost in the shuffle. My final rating for AER Memoreis of Old is a 6 out of 10. It's a game that is slightly above average in my mind. It has some fun ideas and concepts going on here, but they just never quite take off. This is the kind of game that would make me look forward to seeing what future work the developer would come out with, but sadly Forgotten Key closed in 2019. I know that AER won all kinds of indie awards when it came out, but it just wasn't a game that really resonated that much with me. I'm sure that there are those who will like it a bit more than I do, but it just really failed to click with me all that much. You may enjoy partaking in that human dream of flight over some pretty landscapes. That's enough to make you happy? Then have fun flying around the world of AER. For me though, the dream just felt a bit empty.